well as authors, Mr. Navtej Sarna. Uh, I'll tell you a little bit about us. We go way back, but before that, I just wanted to say that he holds the unique distinction, and correct me if I'm wrong, Navtej, of being India's longest serving spokesman for the MEA. I think he served for 6 years or so. And that's a fantastic record. In addition, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't think of anybody else who is India's ambassador to three of our most important, should I say, strategic countries, with which India has a tie. The United States, of course, the United Kingdom. He was High Commissioner there, as well as, the ambassador to Israel. And I think it was in his tenure that our strategic relationship, our cultural relationship, and our diplomatic relationship with Israel was actually ramped up, from being, on the back burner for so long. So his contribution, to India's, diplomacy is really unparalleled. And in addition, one of the best compliments I heard about you, Navtej, was from one of our fellows, who is a great fan of your work, your books. And he
That's
says, क्या गजब का लिखते हैं, he told me. उनका प्रोज जो है गद्य एकदम कविता जैसे. He writes, what I was told is that he writes he writes poetry in prose. That is, his prose writings they flow like poetry, So I think this was a great compliment that was paid to you by one of our fellows. I met him on our walk on Sunday, and he said, "We're all looking forward to listening to you." I just wanted to say a word about this series, which was meant to try to calibrate and understand, India's position in the changing world order. We've heard from, the Prime Minister and several others that this is not just a crisis for India, but also an opportunity. So, how can we position ourselves in this changing world order? And we heard from Lieutenant General Atta Hasnain on Friday that we have to replay this, multipolar world in such a way that India comes out actually stronger in the process. And we discussed China at great length, and we saw how the challenges that China is posing us in our own neighborhood, and how India has also reached out to the US at this crucial juncture to try to counterbalance this this pressure that we are facing on our borders, not only in Ladakh but also in Nepal, and so on. So we have to understand what is happening in the world around us, and are we, for example, on the brink of a new Cold War? And is it really the case that somehow the United States as a superpower has thrived on Cold Wars, having a well-defined enemy somehow gets them to get their act together. I mean, I witnessed a bit of it when I was in the US, and Ronald Reagan came to power after a wonderful, very kind Southern president, Jimmy Carter, with long lasting relations with India. His mother, Lillian Carter herself, had come to India and so forth. But after the Iran hostage crisis, the mood in America was that they did not really want a president perceived to be weak. And Ronald Reagan came at that period as a Hollywood actor, not even such a well known actor. And he completely transformed the United States. And you might even say won the Cold War with the USSR. He brought down the USSR, in a very complicated strategic alliance with the Pope and with Eastern European countries and so forth. And just this morning, I was reading that Joe Biden has got the Democratic nomination. So in November, we are seeing, two well-defined presidential candidates going to the hustings, and we also see the Floyd sparked riots and protests all over the US and all over the world. So it's a very complex world environment. And the question is, what is it that India can do? And before I turn it to Mr. Sarna, I wanted to tell all our friends that, you know, uh, I remember Navtej way back in the 80s, in fact, late 70s to be precise, when he was in Sri Ram College and was one of the top debaters in Delhi University in the circuits. He was my senior, so I always looked up to him. He was so calm. He presented his points, so brilliantly, and he was a role model. And I might say that he always defeated me. I always came second or third, but we looked up to him at that time. And I want to remember one more anecdote. One fine day, I happened to be at Bombay House in Mumbai in Mr. Maligamwala's, and whom should I see there but Navtej? And he had made it to a very, very prestigious Tata Administrative Service. It was a great service. He finished his, I think, his master's in law as well. I can't remember exactly. And I was also in a very strange situation because I was also trying to decide whether to take up my, my heart's desire to go abroad and do a PhD to be a scholar. And Mr. Maligamwala was asking me, why would you do that? Why don't you want to work for the Tatas? It's a great career. And he said, I said that I'll go. I want to train myself and then come back and serve India. And he laughed, and then there was a glass top on his table, and he said, "I'm writing notes on this glass top." He tapped the top, and then he says, "If you really want to serve India, look at this young man, Navtej Sarna. He's joined the Foreign Service. That's what you should be doing." So I remember that also. Maybe Navtej has quite forgotten that. And before I welcome you, I just want to end this brief introduction with a line from the Zafarnama that you have so brilliantly translated, and the Book of Nanak. I must say that apart from the diplomacy and the writing, there's a deep spiritual pursuit in everything that Mr. Sarna has done. And I love these lines. They're very well known from the Zafarnama, and they're right at the top of his introduction. Chunkar az hame hilate dar gazast, halal ast bardan bi samsher dast. So he translates it like this: when all has been tried and yet justice is not in sight, it is then right to pick up the sword. It is then right to fight. These beautiful lines from Guru Gobind Singh, written to Aurangzeb, continue to inspire us. And thank you so much, Navtej, for joining us today. All yours.
Thank you so much, Makaran. Thank you for the invitation to be here with you and your scholars. And also, thank you for recollecting in your very generous introduction all the lovely associations that we have of decades ago. You're right, I remember all that very, very well and very fondly. And I remember your elocution besides the debating and your poetry, which has marked you ever since in your intellectual growth with such distinction. And so proud to see you heading this very, very illustrious institution. So very, very honored to be here with your fellows. I wish it could be in person, but the earth has to stop shaking for that. So eventually it will. I thought I would make a few points. Basically, since the subject that was suggested says India, United States, and the post-COVID world. So I think rather than just look at the possibilities for India, I'd like to put them into the perspective of the India-United States relationship. I'll try not to make this all about India-US relationship because there is so much more. But I think if we take that as an anchor, we can probably go into a wider discussion after that. I think it's a couple of presumptions here that the India-US relationship will change dramatically or can change dramatically in the post-COVID scenario. And the second presumption is that the world order is actually going to change. Or is it going to be more of the same with some nuanced differences. So I think these are some questions which we can examine on the way. But I think the India-US relationship, we almost have forgotten where we were. There's so much has happened in the last 4 months that, that it is sort of, it's wiped the slate clean in a way. The embassies are shut. People are worried about going out. People are worried about getting their kith and kin back to India. All sorts of things have actually put stopped the clock on where this relationship was in February, where President Trump came. And it's only February. We are only in June. It's just not even 4 months yet. But so much has changed. But before I come to what Trump and Prime Minister Modi had sort of structured together over the last 3 years, I think it's useful to see where we actually were in the India-US relationship from the days that we remember. And you mentioned some of those days. I think for years and years, for the first 50 years of our diplomatic engagement, we were called there was an old Foreign Service ambassador from the United States, Ambassador Dennis Cooks, who wrote a famous book which became famous in the 90s, called Estranged Democracies. And that was the sort of feeling that we had, that sort of encapsulated what was happening between our two democracies. We had a democratic cushion to enable our relationship. We had commonalities. We had a lot of people traveling. We had students going. But somehow, through the 60s, 70s, 80s, we were always on the other side of history than the other person. So we were looking at the world differently. And a lot of it was because of the Cold War, because we were supposed to be in, although we were non-aligned, everybody in America thought we were in the Soviet camp. On many world issues, we ended up looking at things differently. And there was a very sort of, at best, what I can call an episodic relationship. We had our good days and our bad days. And whether you see, whether it was 1971 when you had the USS Enterprise sailing into the Bay of Bengal, or you had in the 90s, you had differences over our nuclear policy. There was a lot of estrangement, despite the fact that we were two large democracies at work. There's something began to change in the 90s. And 90s was, things, the world changed, really. So maybe the pandemic here makes an inflection point in the world, which changes everything. But the last major change that we saw was at the end of the Cold War. We saw the end of the Soviet Union. We saw people scrambling to make different relationships. We saw people taking another look from a realpolitik angle, and so did India. And in the 90s, it also coincided with the beginning of our economic reforms. So suddenly in the 90s, began a change of vision in the United States that, okay, this country, let's take a look at it. What are these guys about? And frankly, I always feel, since I was there personally present at that time in Washington, that in the immediate aftermath of our 98 nuclear tests, there was a kind of wake-up call. And that India had actually conducted these nuclear tests. They had kept it a secret successfully tested nuclear devices. And then there was a lot of anger. There was a lot of browbeating. There was a lot of fist shaking. But at the same time, there was a newfound curiosity. There was a certain why, and so we were going out and explaining why we had to do this. That we have two nuclear armed weapons on our weapon states on our border, one explicit and one implied, or clandestine. But nevertheless, there they are. And the world, we have been screaming ourselves hoarse for global disarmament, and nobody has listened to us. So and so on and so forth. A dialogue started, the famous Jaswant Singh stroke Talbot dialogue, which then began a recognition of each other's concerns, built up a deeper understanding about each other. It also coincided with the IT revolution coming in India, which was of much use in terms of professionals to the US as it faced Y2K problems, and so on and so forth. And then we had the beginning, the Clinton visit to India and Prime Minister Vajpayee's visit to Washington, D.C., which then started a very positive mood. Clinton was absolutely bowled over on his visit to India. He spoke to a packed parliament. He danced with village women in Rajasthan. He did all sorts of things. He went to Chandrababu Naidu's cyber tech city and got a driving license. So he was, given the whole 6 yards. So he went back with a very positive feeling. And I think this positive feeling, if we today look back at India-US relations, there has been an upward graph for the last 20 years or so. So whether it's Republicans or Democrats in the United States, the graph has been upward. There have been nuances. I think President Bush was also very, very positive. He had a very close personal relationship with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and he actually started the whole nuclear thing by signing off on the Indo-US, or starting the process and then signing off on the Indo-US nuclear deal. Something which fundamentally changed the manner in which India and the US can cooperate in terms of not just weaponry, but dual-use technologies and related matters. And I think President Obama also carried this on in different ways. I think when President Trump came to power, 2016 November was when he was elected. I had the distinction or payment for past sins to be sent to Washington 48 hours before President Trump won the election. And I saw what a crazy place Washington suddenly became, because this was not a normal Republican government that was coming in. This was not, of course, a Democratic government. This was a government coming out completely out of the Wild West. And nobody knew anybody. There were no systems, there were no positions being filled. So it was a challenge for India to continue to make sure that the graph remained upwards, that President Trump understood, and his colleagues, as they came into power, who were new to the game, and many of them understood the importance of India, understood where India-US relations were. And I think the story at that time, which consistently, fortunately, it was conveyed and they understood, was that here is a democracy with which you have a long-standing relationship, a democracy which has a similar worldview as the United States, a democracy which borders China, a democracy with which you have already started a decent defense relationship, and more important from the industry point of view, that here's a huge market. You have a 600 million middle class coming up. Here is not just a destination for American business, but also a source, particularly of professionals. And the big American companies that's why, very positive on our side. So this was the story when President Trump came into power. Fortunately, in the 2.5 years that one saw personally, and now we are well into the fourth year of President Trump, I think broadly the upward graph has been maintained. And I'll just pinpoint some of the things on which we've been very positively converging. And these are all in the strategic basket. For instance, on defense relations. I mean, there was a time when India and the US virtually had no defense trade, about 15 years ago. Now there's a trade we have purchased about $18 billion worth of American weaponry. At least 3 American aircraft are being flown by our services. You have India today exercises more in military terms with the United States than with any other country. Are you getting me, or is there something wrong? All right. So India today exercises more with the United States than with any other country. Uh, and we have signed most of the foundational agreements, as they are called, with the United States, whether they are the logistics agreement or the communication security, the COMCASA. And now we are on towards trying to sign the last one, which is left. So what these agreements do is that they create a web of trust, that we can share technology with you, we can share weaponry with you, and be sure that this remains away from so-called enemy hands. So I think one was the defense relationship. The second major strategic gain in recent years has been the Indo-Pacific Vision. The President Trump's administration rolled out its Indo-Pacific Vision in 2017. And in that vision, India has a major role. India is seen as the other bookend between, they call it, say, between Hollywood and Bollywood. So, you have two democratic bookends, and you have these large swathe of the ocean, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, which is going to be the center for trade in the years to come, the center for energy travel. And you have a large number of countries who are looking for direction. In a way, from the US point of view, this Indo-Pacific vision could be seen as a response to China's One Belt, One Road initiative. We took a slightly different stand on that, but the point remains that here was an entire new area of cooperation, where India had been acting on its own in ASEAN, and pretty much a lot from the Look East to the Act East policies. Here was a chance to now begin a convergence with the United States. So that was the second strategic gain. And to put it down on paper, the US changed its famous, their largest command of their armed services is the PACOM, or the Pacific Command, based in Hawaii, which was attacked during Pearl Harbor. They changed the name to IndoPacific. Now, I would say this is not just verbal gymnastics. It fundamentally changes the way the US bureaucracy, the US defense bureaucracy, the budgeting, the focus, the policy focus changes once you call it the Indo-Pacific. And that's what happened in 2018. The other factor which has grown during the years is the Indian diaspora, which became a very important pillar of this bilateral relationship. And the diaspora, which used to be which was almost about 4 million today, was always successful in terms of being professional. Doctors, hoteliers, engineers, IT people. But now the important thing is that they have become politically active, and they are actively funding elections. They are lobbying, and they are present in the US Congress. I mean, we went from 1 to 4 in the present Congress, and 1 in the Senate, Indian origin. So I think that is another factor which has been a strong impetus in bringing India and the US together. Now, this is where we were when President Trump came to India in February, more or less. And these were all the positives. There was a huge irritant. And the huge irritant was trade. The trade, because Trump has been extremely transactional on trade. Trade problems between India and US are nothing new. We've had issues before. We've had WTO disputes. We've had disputes on intellectual property rights. Uh, we've had disputes on, child labor, and so on and so forth for years. But now President Trump has made trade a kind of transactional issue. So, for him, it comes right up there. For instance, trade balance. Now, we have a $140 billion trade between India and the US, and we have a trade balance in our favor of about $25-26 billion. Now, that became such a big issue because he took the top 10 countries which had a trade balance against the US and wanted it removed. So, in earlier administrations, this was looked away from because that was a globalized world they were looking of, and negative trade balance did not necessarily mean a bad thing. And at the same time, they saw the whole India relationship in a larger strategic lens. And this came under the policy of strategic altruism. Let look away from these small irritants, let look at the big positives. But President Trump was having none of that. So that's why trade became such a big issue, the trade balance. So we started buying a lot of civil aviation aircraft. We started buying oil and natural gas. We started to reduce that trade balance. There were market access issues on both sides. And there were other major issues like data localization, the use of credit cards, and so on and so forth, which were at the on the table when Trump came to India. The visit went very well, as you all saw. There was a lot of bonhomie. There was a lot of popular hoo-ha about it. He loved the huge crowds. And clearly, we were at a stage where we could have got these irritants sorted out. And then, unfortunately, coronavirus took over the world, and we sort of got stuck where we are. So that more or less is where the bilateral, to give you a sort of graph of the bilateral relationship in a few words over the last 30 odd years. So that's where we were. Now there were some trends which were clearly visible, and these are important to see that will these continue in the post-COVID world. One trend was the US looking inwards, the US withdrawing from a global role. Trump had come to power on the fact that, make America great again, bring the jobs back, pull the troops back from Afghanistan and Syria. Don't spend on the UN and all these useless things. Let me, we must get more bang for a buck. People must pick up their own weight, and so on and so forth. So America looking inwards and withdrawing from global presence. That's one trend. The second trend was China's rise. And that I don't think there are two views about it. China was not just rising, but China was rising in a more and more increasingly in a more muscular fashion. So the OBOR was a very aggressive strategy of not only making their presence felt, but virtually taking over strategic facilities in many countries. China